Hi, everyone. Just want to add a quick introduction to the reading you're going to do from Genesis. So, a lot of you, I'm sure, have a basic sense of what's happening here in Genesis chapters 1 to 3. But let me just say a word about it. This is from the Hebrew Bible. So, if you are coming to it from the Christian tradition, you might think of this as the Old Testament. Which is supplemented by the New Testament. If you're coming from the Jewish tradition, it is the just the Hebrew Bible or the Torah. All right. And if you're in Islam as well, the creation account and many of the stories from the Hebrew Bible are repeated. So these are kind of this is a creation account which is shared across a number of religious traditions. But this one that we're looking at was originally in Hebrew. Now, another kind of misconception about this is that it's at the beginning of the Hebrew Bible, but it wasn't written first. It's not like this was a story that someone sat down and wrote from beginning to end, right? There's a lot of authors in the Hebrew Bible, and some of these creation accounts are by no means the earliest parts of the Bible. And that's especially true here of Genesis chapter 1, these 7 days of creation. This was, in all likelihood, fairly late in the game as far as texts that are included in the Hebrew Bible. Reading through Genesis 1 to 3, so we have the 7 days of creation, and then we have the story that you'll recognize for Adam and Eve. A lot of times people don't realize that there's actually two creation accounts that are jammed up against each other here, and that originally would have been separated. So we have Genesis chapter 1, these 7 days, and then in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no one to till the ground. Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground. So what we have here is a second account, which probably stood originally on its own, and then in terms of how they fit together. And you'll notice also the name for God changes, that it's just God in chapter 1, and then you have Lord God in chapter 2, and Lord with all capital letters, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, which means that's Yahweh, the name for God, which is there and which is behind that word Lord with all capital letters. So we have these two accounts put together. The first account are the famous 7 days of creation. Read through that and think about it. This is often attributed to priestly group of writers that, one strand of the Hebrew Bible, very concerned about order, about purity, about, making sense, how things kind of come together. So there's a lot of division and order, and God saying things are good, those representing more priestly concerns. And then in the second part, a little more primitive even, because God is walking around, Adam and Eve, he's in the garden, he's walking, they hide themselves from him, much more kind of anthropomorphic and probably representing an earlier way of thinking and understanding God. Whereas in chapter 1, you have God speaking and creating things. So very, you can tell that they don't really match up. There's two different versions of the creation account. And then on top of that, very different ways of imagining God. As you're reading through this, like Genesis chapter 1 of these 7 days, think about what's being talked about. So, for example, in chapter 1, verse 6, God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters," or a firmament. So this is like literally a hard shell separating the waters above from the waters below. And later on, when the flood comes in chapter 7, there will be windows opened in that firmament to let the flood waters into the earth. So there's a very ancient conceptions of the world that are being expressed here. And I always, in courses where I go a little bit more into this, explain that this is really not something that can be matched up or merged with contemporary science. And that's not the way. I would urge you not to read it that way. Don't look at, what is correct and what is not correct. Think about it in more theological terms. For example, why is light and darkness separated on the first day of creation, but the sun and the moon aren't created until day 4. You say, well, how is there light without the sun? And well, think of that as a demotion of the sun, that there are cultures like the ancient Egyptians that we'll see next week, where the sun was literally a god. And so possible rather for us to say, okay, there's theological points that are being made in this text that we can discern. All right. Now, your question that I'd like you to answer, read through these first 3 chapters. Another one of the assigned texts is Psalm 104. So there's 2 possible responses that you can make. The first is read these first 3 chapters and write about how do these chapters reflect an agricultural society. All right. Human beings existed in bands, small bands, and hunter-gatherer sort of situations for hundreds of thousands of years, right? But here, I would argue that there's a very strong agricultural perspective. And in both the Adam and Eve story and in the first 6 days of creation, where do you see agricultural concerns reflected? So that's option 1. Option 2 is to watch the assigned Our Planet episode, and then to read Psalm 104. And in this case, I'd like you to think about how is wonder at the natural world reflected in these 2? Is it different, or are these reflecting the same kind of wonder about the natural world? Remember, that's one of the ways that we thought about Edward Wilson today, is as he was religious in the way that he thought about, that he felt wonder and in an emotional almost response at the natural world. How does David Attenborough's Our Planet episode and Psalm 104 reflect that same sense of wonder? So 2 possible options. Respond to one of those questions for your response for Monday on week 2. All right. Have a good weekend.